This is always such an awkward time, like right before we're really starting. But, everyone's trickling in.
Yeah, that's so true.
Just kind of sitting here.
I'm showing we're ready for 4 p.m. if you want to get started.
All right, let's do it. All right, everyone, thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar series. Um, Before we begin, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. So the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center acknowledges the Pueblo, Ute, Paiute, Ndee, and Jicarilla Apache, people on whose traditional homelands this institution sits. Our work is not possible without Indigenous people in the past, present, and future. We respectfully recognize and honor ancestral and descendant Indigenous communities for their contributions to all humankind. Crow Canyon is grateful to all Indigenous people and supports the preservation and protection of cultural traditions, ancestral connections, and sacred lands. I also just a quick update about how to put questions and into the chat. Be sure to use the circled Q&A section here. If you put your questions into the actual chat box there, we will not get to them. So you have to put them in the Q&A section. If you have any difficulties with Zoom, we're also live on Facebook right now. So that's another way you could see this. And also, you could subscribe to our YouTube page and look at past videos as well. The next 2 weeks, we've got some awesome webinars planned. One looking at current research on Fremont farming communities in northwestern Colorado by Dr. Jason LaBelle. And then the following week, we have an awesome webinar scheduled looking at cotton remains from the Haney site, which is the project we're currently working on now. So that one's going to be really awesome by Susie Smith. So join us for those. Also, if we just want to say that these webinars wouldn't be possible without your support, your continued support and donations. If you are interested in contributing to Crow Canyon, please go ahead and scan this QR code. You'll get a little more information about how you could do that. I'll stay here for a beat just in case you need to whip out your phone, scan something, look at it. We'll do 3, 2, 1. Another just kind of note about if you're thinking about contributing to Crow Canyon, we have a funding campaign going on right now regarding our amazing database. Crow Canyon has one of the largest archaeological databases in North America. We are in the process of revamping the front end of this database, the public interface to the database. And so if you want to learn more about how you can support us in this endeavor, you can go to this URL, but you could also find it on the website if you just go to crowcanyon.org. So we're really excited about this. Okay, so let's get into introducing Dr. Matt Hill. So Matt is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Iowa. His research involves work with archaeological sites that date from the end of the Ice Age to the historic period and appear in very different environmental settings, including the Great Basin, Great Plains, Atlantic coast of Virginia, and India. So we're going to turn it over to Matt right now. Thank you so much for joining us and agreeing to do this, Matt.
Oh, no problem. Thank you very much, Jonathan, for that introduction. And thank you all for attending. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all about our research here at the University of Iowa. Let me share my screen. All right, let's try this one. All right. Hold on, sorry. Oh, hold on.
Stop your screen, just stop sharing.
Yep. Sorry, I don't know what's. Let's try this again. Sorry about this.
It's okay.
All right. Okay. All right, let's try this one.
I'm seeing your Zoom screen. All right. Do you want to shut off presenter mode by going to display options?
Oh.
And it stops. Like when you go to display options next time, just swap presenter mode, which is the first option there.
All right. Okay, let's try this again.
Perfect.
That looks perfect.
Okay. All right. That's there. Okay. So yeah, again, thank you all for coming. I want to talk about some work that my colleague Margaret Beck and I and our students have been working on for the last almost 20 years. And it's an issue, the issue we've been looking at is an unusual situation of kind of culture contact and interaction between kind of Rio Grande Puebloan people and Indigenous Central Plains group, in this case, ancestral Apaches, that created a multi-generation complex social group starting in about the 1600s and probably going into the 1700s. What I want to talk about is the kind of core part of this talk. We'll be looking at the Scott County Pueblo, which is, as I'll talk about, a masonry Pueblo that is found in Scott County in what is now western Kansas. And it represents the locality of a long-term interaction between Puebloan peoples and ancestral Apache people. And it was, this site has been kind of interest to researchers for well over 100 years. And I want to kind of talk about a little bit about what we've known and how we've approached this site and how archaeology has kind of changed its opinion about this site over time. But what's most interesting about this is this interaction between Puebloan people and ancestral Apache people created a new community that had not existed anywhere else, and is a kind of a hybrid or ethnogenetic creation of a new identity for people in western Kansas. And it is important to understand that this unusual migration, this unusual co-residence and evolving kind of relationship between very different peoples is part of a kind of a social landscape that's occurring across the plains and elsewhere as a result of kind of Spanish colonialism, and primarily centered in the Rio Grande Valley of New Mexico. But it's having rippling effects hundreds of miles outside kind of the center of colonial occupation. Now, our story is really set in a very modest drainage in western in western Kansas called the Ladder Creek drainage. It's a not much to say about it, except it is a tributary of the Smoky Hill River. It is a rather old drainage that has cut through the high plains to create a large valley. And while this stretch of Ladder Creek is only about 4 or 5 miles long, it has an incredible archaeological history. The current area is a state park, which has created a lot of kind of archaeological interest in this area over the last 100 years. And this small stretch of this river has about 89 sites within it, which is a surprisingly large number within a small area. And about a quarter of those or so are ancestral Apache sites, earlier sites including Paleo-Indian dating to about 10,000 years ago, archaic, woodland, and other sites exist. But there's an unusual density of ancestral Apache sites in this drainage. And since about 2008, Margaret and I have worked in this area as well as our students and colleagues to kind of investigate this really unusual landscape in which multiple ethnic groups have come together and created a new kind of type of community. And so over the last almost 20 years or so, we've kind of tried to reanalyze existing archaeological collections. We've done new surveys and excavations of a number of these sites. And we've tried to intensively redate about 11 sites in the valley and kind of outside, kind of in similar areas, to get a sense of what makes this stretch of Ladder Creek so unusual. And arguably the most unusual aspect of this region is that in the center of Ladder Creek is a 7-room masonry pueblo that was first discovered by scientists in kind of the 1880s and was first investigated in 1890. And I'll talk about kind of this pueblo. It is the farthest northern and western pueblo known anywhere in North America. Now, because there's a pueblo on the plains of Kansas, it has attracted a lot of interest by archaeologists and other researchers over the last 100 or so years. And 5 major episodes of excavation has focused in and around this site. The initial interest, particularly in the 1800s, was really focused on the pueblo itself, without kind of really understanding the broader social context, archaeological setting, nature of why a pueblo would be there. Later work has kind of expanded more away from the pueblo and really highlighted kind of the Apachean occupation of the site. Now, one of the things that attracted us to this site, and one of the issues that we've tried to focus on for most of our work, is that each of these kind of major excavations have really been done kind of in isolation. And there has been very little attempt to kind of integrate or understand how the different results of these different excavations fit together and answer some basic questions about who lived there, when was it occupied, what happened after the pueblo was abandoned. We knew very little. In fact, despite a huge amount of work at this site, there was never actually a map of all the excavations. The one that you see in this slide, we actually had to put together ourselves. And that's how kind of desperate the other prior work on this site has been. It's really just been focused on an archaeologist doing their little bit, and it's never been part of a bigger narrative about what's going on at this site. Now, as I said, the site was found in 1898. Samuel Williston was a paleontologist at the University of Kansas. And his university gave him $2,000 to do research that summer. And he split it in half. Half of it went and paid a crew to go to Wyoming and investigate dinosaurs. And the other half was to support Handel T. Martin, a paleontologist, but native of Kansas, to investigate unusual claims coming out of Western Kansas. And particularly, there was reports by collectors and residents of the nearby towns that these unusual kind of pottery and Puebloan artifacts were being excavated by local collectors out of this area. And so Williston and Martin initiated a field season in the summer of 1898 and found a 7-room masonry Pueblo. And we'll talk about kind of what they found in a minute. But the shock of finding a Pueblo this far from the Southwest immediately led them to kind of look through the historic literature. And they came across in various Spanish accounts of a region called El Quartelejo. And this early work is often referred to this site. And in fact, for much of its history, the site itself was referred to as El Quartelejo. El Quartelejo is a term that you find in a variety of 1600 and early 1700 Spanish accounts referring to the plains areas kind of north and west of the Rio Grande Valley. And its context is, it's been brought up to refer to an area in which residents of Taos, Picaris, and several other Pueblos would leave the Rio Grande Valley to escape the Spanish and live and interact with their Apachean friends and trading partners. And so from the very beginning, because they found a Pueblo, they found pottery and other artifacts that were associated with this. This was understood very clearly as an area where Taos and Picaris, Puebloan people abandoned the Southwest and entered a kind of a sanctuary area to live on the high plains well away from the Spanish. Now, roughly 40 years later, the famous plains archaeologist Waldo Wedel of the Smithsonian, knowing and hearing accounts of the Pueblo, was drawn to kind of understand the site to better kind of clarify his understanding of plains Southwest contact and interaction. So in 1939, Wedel put a crew into the field to investigate the Pueblo and worked in 3 major areas. One immediately kind of north of the Pueblo. The Pueblo at this point had been pot hunted largely or intensively, and Wedel assumed there was really nothing left of the Pueblo. So they were interested in looking at what's around the Pueblo. So they did an area immediately north and 2 areas to the south. And one of the things that they found is they found very little evidence of Puebloan artifacts and materials. They did find a small kind of oval, what they termed as kind of a wiki-up structure, a series of cooking hearths or roasting pits, such as the one shown here, as well as some refuse pits, trash-filled pits around the Pueblo. And in fact, in this trench north of the Pueblo, they actually did a pretty nice stratigraphic excavation that from our perspective, shows that what they were dealing with, and largely what Wedel was excavating, was deposits stratigraphically below the Pueblo and its floor. And Wedel didn't quite understand this, that he was potentially digging in earlier deposits. He recognized that the artifacts and deposits were associated with ancestral Apache people. And this kind of changed his understanding of the site. And in fact, he was quite frustrated that there was very little evidence in his mind of the Puebloan people and their artifacts, decorated pottery or other grinding tools. And in fact, recognized, and as a result of that, that the Pueblo itself did not indicate a presence of Puebloan migrants, that he interpreted the site as being built by Apache peoples who interacted with Puebloan peoples to the south and west, and as a result took on some unusual attributes of their technology and including building and living within a Pueblo. So he really changed the story of what was going on at the site and really doubted the presence of a Puebloan residential population. In the 50s, there was a little more work, but it was really not until 1970 where Tom Witty, the state archaeologist of Kansas, came back to the site. In the late 60s, this site was acknowledged as kind of a historic landmark. And Kansas was very determined to kind of highlight its historic importance and, in fact, create an open-air museum. So Witty was drawn back to the site to actually reconstruct it and make an open-air museum, which still exists today and people can visit. So he actually reopened the Pueblo area and expanded outwards to investigate the Pueblo. And while he sees a Pueblo that has been greatly destroyed from the 1800s, from what was found in the 1800s, he did find most of the major, many of the major features and a number of walls, and then went on to recreate the Pueblo using local materials and concrete in more or less the footprint of its original construction. So we came into this project as a result of these major excavations over the past decades, and recognized that there was debates about who lived there, why did people come to the site, when was the site occupied, and then what happened after the site. And this was kind of the driving factors. And our goal was to kind of integrate these decades of research in which the researchers themselves have come to kind of disparate and often conflicting interpretations. So I want to kind of just go through some of these questions and give you a better sense of what this area and this site has to tell us about the history of Plains Pueblo interaction. Our approach has been to think about this question of who lived there based on kind of technology and daily practice. All people and their material remains, their stuff, and their daily actions of cooking, building, living and building houses are culturally informed activities. And the nature of the objects we use and forms, how we do simple tasks like cooking and cleaning and constructing facility, our residences tell us about our history, our culture, and the traditions that we follow. And I present here a painting by an artist who lives in the region, Charlie Norton, who's trying to kind of talk about the Scott County Pueblo. And this is, I'm not going to get into the accuracy of this of this image, but it does present the complexity of the site. If we're looking at technology, of stuff, of structures, of tools, of daily practices, Scott County Pueblo shows us kind of two ways of life that seemingly are quite contradictory. There's clearly a kind of Puebloan presence, but there is also, right alongside and often even within the Pueblo, artifacts and materials and actions and behaviors that suggest there are ancestral Apache people living there. Now, one thing that is absolutely clear through all the excavations is that this Pueblo was constructed by Puebloan people. It is a 7-room masonry Pueblo. In fact, there is a multiple periods of reconstruction and renovation. The north central room is actually divided into two many years after it was constructed. There are raised benches in room 1s and 2s. In the southeastern corner, there's actually a large trough metate within a grinding bin. Throughout the floor of the Pueblo, there are stone-lined rectangular hearths in each room. There are numerous examples of table polychrome, table red, plain red, sherds in and around the Pueblo, including on the floor. There's a series of pipes that are a combination of plains form, but also forms that are common in Pecos Pueblo. There's vesicular basalt grinding stones. Vesicular basalt is not found anywhere in the local area. There are rectangular two-handed monos. All of the construction, all of the materials in this and how it's formed suggests the builders and people who live there were Puebloan people. Here's kind of a various artistic constructions of the Pueblo itself. It did not have exterior doors. All entryways to each room was through the roof, through a ladder. And in fact, there was a series of post holes along the southern wall, outside wall of the Pueblo, suggests there was a roofed covered kind of work area, kind of a ramada structure. Also indicating that there was a presence of Puebloan people, particularly potters, but very likely other family members, is that using local clays that they got within a few miles of the Pueblo, they made a local copy of table red, not a technology or approach used by plains groups. They made various vessel forms, such as seed jars or wide-mouthed serving bowls, or what's often referred to as soup bowls. Again, forms that are not made by local groups. There's even kind of rectangular trough metates, a grinding stone form that's really not found anywhere in this area of the plains, made of a local or a regional sandstone called Dakota sandstone. So not only were the Puebloan peoples bringing ceramics that were made in the Rio Grande Valley, they were making local copies of all of these types. Now, within the Pueblo and around the Pueblo were tens of thousands of tools, sherds, lithic tools, that were clearly associated with ancestral Apache people, that were not used by Puebloans and indicate a very different technology and approach and use in not indicative of kind of a Great Plains population, but not from the American Southwest, very distinct from that. Now, who are these kind of ancestral Apache? Archaeologically, it's a complex that has one of the worst archaeological names called the Dismal River Complex. It is a name that is derived from the Dismal River drainage, an area in western Nebraska where some of the earliest ancestral Apache sites. These are also known as ancestral Ndee sites. The Apachean archaeology of the Central Plains is very robust. There's almost 300 known sites, although many are kind of very ephemeral sites. And they date, at least in the West, starting around 1200 and continuing to about 1800s. In the East, they show up a little later, really 1500s, and continue into probably the late 1700s, early 1800s. The Plains Apachean life was a little varied regionally. In the West, it was a much more mobile hunter-gatherer existence. In the East, there was a more sedentary aspect of life in which kind of small villages were constructed, in which people grew corn, squash, and other domesticates, as well as a very strong hunter-gatherer kind of subsistence base. But it's a broad area that expands from Wyoming, Nebraska, Kansas, and mostly the eastern portion of Colorado. Our study of the Dismal River chronology suggests to us that there is kind of an east-west trend in occupation. Along the western margins of the Central Plains and into the foothills of the Rocky, there's a very early appearance of ancestral Apachean people, starting somewhere between about 1245 and 1430. And in the West, to kind of think about Kansas and Nebraska, this Apachean people don't seem to show up until about the early 1500s or so. Now, everywhere, based on radiocarbon, there seems to be an end to Apachean presence somewhere around 1800s. Now, this is an archaeologically based, radiocarbon-based analysis. There are clearly historic accounts of Puebloan people well after this fact, and in fact, the Plains Apachean people never really leave the plains. So this end date of this complex is really kind of a bias of the archaeological record in radiocarbon. But what we see is a long-term presence in the Great Plains by Apachean people. Although they themselves do not originate in the plains. They are, in fact, before about 1250, their ancestors lived in kind of the subarctic of what is now Canada and Alaska. And starting about 1200 years ago, these ancestral Athabascan groups started to expand their range, in part probably due to a result of a series of very violent volcanic eruptions out of Mount Churchill on the Alaskan-Canadian border. And the environmental disruptions created by this volcanic eruption likely created a need to expand out into areas unaffected by this eruption. And so ancestral Athabascan people moved kind of north and west, as well as east into the northern plains. Interestingly, there were a series of other long-distance migrations, including at least a small number of Athabascan speakers that entered the Pacific Northwest in Oregon and California into the Great Basin. And these migrations were extremely long-distance moves, 1,500, 900 miles apiece. They also moved further south and eventually become kind of the ancestors of modern-day Apachean peoples across Arizona, New Mexico, and have clear ancestral ties to the modern Navajo. But they enter kind of the margins of the Great Central Plains about 1200, living in a series of areas around what is now the Great Salt Lake, but also along the Front Range in what is now near kind of Denver. But they enter this area during the late prehistoric period when numerous indigenous groups who trace their ancestries themselves back millennia were living across various aspects of the Central Plains, including the Upper Republican groups, Antelope Creek in Texas. Obviously, there was various groups in the Southwest, and in the Salt Lake, the Fremont peoples. They enter the southern area in a time in which the landscape was actually full. But again, associated with kind of the little ice age of the 1200s and 1300s, many of the Central Plains groups that had been there for millennia are kind of reorganized and move and abandon portions, or at least greatly depopulate portions of the Central Plains. And this results in many of the Apachean people that we know today and archaeologically expressed across Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, parts of Utah, and the Central Plains. And it's, in fact, the origins of the indigenous plains people that the Puebloans live alongside in Scott County. Now, why did the Puebloan people leave the Southwest? And it's not just a small movement. Many Puebloan peoples, particularly at the time of Spanish contact, moved out into the plains, although that trip could be tens, in some cases, a very short trip. What we're talking about in Scott County is a migration of almost 500 kilometers into an area in which prior Puebloan people had never lived, and is greatly removed from their homeland in the Rio Grande Valley. Now, why did they move? Here, historic accounts have documented this very well. Largely, they enter the plains, usually more or less in northeastern New Mexico or nearby areas of Colorado, is to avoid Spanish colonial rule. And historical accounts from the mid-1500s through the 1700s talk about multiple kind of either Puebloan uprisings or abandonment of existing pueblos. And it's various accounts, and the traditional account of Scott County Pueblo kind of points to these kind of mid-1600s and early 1700s Puebloan migrants leaving the Southwest. Now, the thing that we have to understand and what can explain why they would travel so far is that they were not randomly moving. They were clearly Puebloan people clearly had ties with Apachean peoples across the plains for centuries. And these trade connections likely facilitated intermarriage between the groups and as well as regional migrations. So when did all of this occur? And we have to kind of understand that the Scott County Pueblo, there's kind of clear stratigraphy that we have with the Pueblo. There is clearly the Pueblo itself. There is a series of floor features and artifacts that represent some of the last use of the Pueblo. Adjacent to and on the surface of the age of the Pueblo, the occupation surface of the Pueblo is a series of pits, trash-filled pits that they dug to build the Pueblo itself and then filled with their rubbish. And then stratigraphically over or underneath the Pueblo are a series of pits that predate the Pueblo itself. And so I want to kind of go through this. The Scott County Pueblo was built on top of and within an existing Apachean site. It was a long-term camp indicated by the large trash bins that filled over time, the structure, the wickiup-like structures, and deposits such as those dug by Witty and Wedel show no real Rio Grande kind of trade wares or these kind of locally made Southwest copies, unlike you see in the Pueblo. There's only kind of Dismal River artifacts in general. There's a few items, a few pots, or excuse me, pipe fragments, a few obsidian artifacts, some Olivella shell that do indicate that before the Pueblo, the Apachean people living on site actually were aware or had some at least indirect contact with Puebloan people and got a few kind of items through trade or exchange. The Pueblo itself, through our dating, appears to be dates around somewhere around 1605 to 1635. And this is quite important to kind of understand that this predates any of the kind of clear historical accounts of kind of Pueblo migrants moving into El Quartelejo. In many cases, it predates those accounts by decades. And it was occupied for a significant period of time. As I said, there was actually kind of remodeling and reworking and renovation of the Pueblo itself. Excavations outside the Pueblo along the west, in fact, found an abandoned rectangular hearth feature outside the Pueblo, which suggests there actually was earlier room blocks that had been either dismantled or fell down. And in and around the Pueblo are where we find the Rio Grande painted ceramics, the non-local copies of Table Red and others, as well as tens of thousands of Dismal River sherds in the Pueblo itself and in their trash that was produced by the occupants of the Pueblo. Now, the Pueblo itself, its life seems to end when it was intentionally burned. And that burning led to kind of a roof collapse and a burning of the floor artifacts and features. In fact, there was a large kind of deposit of corn, several bushels worth in one room, as well as other organic material like bones and other plant remains that seem to have been burned in the burning of this. And we have dated this burning event to somewhere between kind of 1650 and 1680. Now, the importance of that kind of date is that it's also kind of predates the very famous Pueblo revolt in the 1680s in New Mexico, in which after re-establishing control by the Spanish in 1690s, contributed to a series of other migrations out from the Rio Grande Valley. So this dates before that event happened. Now, the burning of the Pueblo did not end the Puebloan presence or Puebloan technology in the Ladder Creek Valley. What happened when the Pueblo was abandoned was that mixed ethnic communities, a combination of Puebloan and Apachean people, continued to live in this area for generations. Our dating of at least 4 of these sites, and again, there's at least 15 or 20 more that date somewhere between about 1680 and 1820. So there was generations of people that are living in this area after the Pueblo burned down. Now, the Puebloan expression and tools kind of change. No one continues to make Pueblos. They live in what we would define as Apachean wickiups, and there's several examples of sites with Apachean houses. They generally have very little kind of painted sherds that were made and manufactured in the Rio Grande Valley. However, local Puebloan technology continues and changes through time. Later groups after the Pueblo was abandoned continued to make local copies of Table Red, for example. but they do change. They don't make exact copies. They continue the technology, but make it their own and kind of adapt over time. They kind of change where the slip is. Their smudging is kind of largely abandoned. Their polishing approach is kind of different and frankly less careful. But what's interesting is they actually are able to reproduce the kind of bright red colors that define table red, and they continue to do that for generations, even though they're living otherwise subsistence, housing, other aspects of Apachean life. So it's kind of this new community that gets created. So kind of running out of time, I'll just kind of quickly change things. So clearly the history of Scott County Pueblo is a byproduct of Spanish disruption to indigenous life in the Rio Grande. And that while many Puebloan people fled their home as a result of Spanish colonialism, Scott County, the Kansas example, is an extreme example of this kind of diaspora out of their homeland because of the great distance that they traveled, the hundreds of kilometers onto the plains, and recognizing that this is a relatively small number of people that's doing this. And the movement into Kansas was not an accidental one. There was clearly pre-existing economic and likely personal bonds that linked these kind of Puebloan migrants to the local Apachean people and facilitated their movement and existence and ultimate incorporation into Apachean life. So they're building on generations of contact and knowledge and relationships to build this new life in Western Kansas. Now, certainly because they built a Pueblo, they brought tools with them from Rio Grande. The original migrants kind of highlighted their separate identity that was clearly distinct from their neighbors, the neighboring Apaches. But over time, they grew increasingly close and interconnected to Apachean peoples. And eventually, while on the surface and more so their history, they took on an Apachean lifeway, they clearly, through their continued use of making local copies of these Rio Grande redwares, many of their foodways, their ceremonies, including their continued use of Puebloan-like pipes, there clearly is an attempt to maintain a connection to their history and their memory of their Rio Grande homeland. And ultimately, what we have is that we actually have kind of an example of ethnogenesis, a new type of group that's neither simply Puebloan nor neither simply Apachean. It's this new intermixing, a new creation, a new society. All right, I kind of ended there, and obviously I want to thank Taylor and Jonathan, and I also want to acknowledge kind of all the support and funders that we've had over time. Okay, so with that, I will stop sharing.
Awesome.
And certainly real happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you so much, Matt. It's just fascinating. We've got questions rolling in, so we're going to get into it. Okay, does it sound good?
That's great. Sounds great.
Okay. So one of the first questions I kind of want to one of the viewers asked is, surely this is not the only small pueblo or intrusion of Pueblo people into the plains. Are there any other sites that are like this that you can think of, or any other suggestions of sites like this, or is it truly unique?
So if you look in kind of the area of the Hickory Apache, there are kind of some kind of examples of this near, and there's others, Pueblitos in kind of the Navajo area. So there are a number of these kinds of sites near or in the Southwest. As you get into kind of the plains proper, while historic accounts suggest and describe these kind of little Pueblo-y structures, we're not aware of any that are found within hundreds of miles of this one. And certainly while these Dismal River groups are throughout Wyoming and Nebraska and Colorado, we're unaware of any Puebloan kind of constructions and to this degree that far out of the side of the Rio Grande. So yes, this happens near the Rio Grande but not hundreds of kilometers away that we're aware of. Hopefully we will find some.
Yeah. One of the things kind of in the same vein of this original question, you talk about, pre-existing evidence for connections, and I'm wondering, is there any kind of say tools, like I think of obsidian sourcing that's been done to establish existing connections in this region? Has that been done? Has that been demonstrated?
Yeah. So in fact, the connections between the plains and the Southwest go back to the Archaic and probably earlier. Things like obsidian from kind of the Jemez region, or tradeware. And certainly it's real minor before about 1450. Okay. Starting around 1450, particularly with Southern Plains groups, Texas, Oklahoma, there are exchanges of larger amounts of materials and likely intermarriage and movements of people back and forth. And there's obviously historical accounts of Apacheans coming in, big dog trains to trade at places like Picaris and others. That Southern Plains kind of connections kind of seem to fall apart around 1600, likely because of disruptions with existing Puebloan communities and abandonment. That kind of falls apart. What we're seeing in Kansas is what happens later, after that disruption. This may go back to why this is not a common or more common expression, because after those Puebloan communities get disrupted and reorganized, I think only a small number of people undertake very large migrations. They certainly move to other pueblos. They certainly move to the Four Corners regions, other parts of New Mexico. But I think those longer-term trade ties that have been established with Southern Plains groups break down, and they have to reinvent connections. And so you do see things like all the obsidian from the Scott County Pueblo is from New Mexico sources. There's sourcing of some of the painted ceramics do indicate that they're coming from New Mexico. And obviously, I think I talked about the sourcing of the groundstone, the vesicular basalt. That's likely. So there is a long history of connections between the plains. This particular group, those older connections fall apart, and they're reinventing connections, I think.
Oh, that's fascinating. One of the questions too that we have is just talking about the viewer asked generally about subsistence practices at the site, and I'm going to take it into a selfish area and talk about hunting. What's hunting like before and after? Like, I mean,
so this is one of the more interesting things. The Puebloan occupants were almost exclusively big game hunters. They were bison hunters. In the trash pits around the Pueblo are minimally parts of 30 bison.
Whoa.
That are killed presumably nearby and transported back and processed back. There is actually very little small game like rabbits or deer, even kind of those traditional hunting that you think of Puebloan people as doing. What is interesting is there's some small game. It's mostly turtle
Wow.
or dog. There is a series of dogs. So what I think is going on is as they move into the plains, or this part of the plains, their traditional kind of Southwest style hunting, the small rabbits and things like that, the deer. Well, all of that is available in the area. There's no reason they couldn't hunt deer, and they took a few. They chose, I think, with the knowledge and assistance of Dismal River, who is an exclusively kind of big game hunter focused economy, to change their and become essentially more specialized hunters than they ever were before. They do grow, the diet continues with planting of corn and squash and things like that. There's evidence of that, but their hunting becomes much more specialized and much more focused on big game.
Well, okay, now I'm going to take into a really selfish area, and I apologize to the viewers, but fishing, is there any evidence of fishing?
No. Now, there's very little use of mussels or other aquatic.
Oh,
There is little evidence of fishing. However, one of the problems is, we're talking the one of the most recent excavations in the 70s. We're talking
right.
1800s, 30s. The screening is not. Our subsequent excavations, not at the Pueblo, but at surrounding sites, uses much finer screening, and we haven't found any.
Oh,
We're
wow.
not quite sure of the. I think this may be a function of the kind of volume of water in Ladder Creek. It's a stream-fed. It's a spring-fed stream. So there is water there. I just don't know that there's enough to produce large fish populations. And frankly, my impression is bison is abundant enough that you may not have to muck around. And there's no like fish hooks or things like that we see.
Gotcha. One question, we have a very specific question that is, where are the collections from this site curated?
They're mostly in the Kansas State Historical Society, has the bulk of the collection. University of Kansas has the collection from the earliest excavations, which is a modest collection. And then the Smithsonian has the materials from the 1930s.
Well, gotcha. Another question is, with, thinking about this, migration experience to the Scott County Pueblo, do you see any other kind of migration scenarios in the Southwest? Have you drawn any kind of parallels or conclusions about that?
Well, I mean, this is part of a long-term adaptation on the part of a number of Puebloan people responding to Spanish colonial oppression, to move or abandon their pueblos and move in with neighboring groups or plains groups or with the Navajo. This is part of that larger diaspora. This is a reaction to colonial occupation. What makes it unusual is just simply the distance that they're undertaking this migration.
Right.
The vast majority of people doing this are moving much shorter distances. This is just extreme.
It's truly unique in multiple ways, right? It's interesting, and thinking of just off the top of my head here, thinking about the link between the distance and the time period, right, of like colonization, like it's got to be, in my head, I'm like, this got to be connected, right?
So, I mean, given the dates that that Pueblo is being built in like the early 1600s, this represents some of the first kind of abandonments after colonial presence. The real establishment of large colonial presence comes actually a little slightly later. So this is a kind of reaction to some of the earliest presence of Spanish.
Yeah. So interesting. Is there any evidence of, for, I guess in the region, this one viewer asks, or just maybe at the site too, they mean about raiding from Comanche raids or influence?
Well, so historically, and I think our archaeological dating does appear to suggest that, and lots of historical accounts suggest that many of the Plains Apachean people living in the more northern and central Plains regions, as Comanches and others come in later in time, are kind of choose to move south and become the modern day Plains Apache, the Jicarilla, the Mescalero Apache, or at least become incorporated with them. So and there are actually a few sites associated with the Comanche in this region. All of them date much later than any of the sites that we're talking about. And certainly, like the burning of the Pueblo is well predates that, probably by centuries.
We actually have, as a perfect segue, we have a question about the burning of the Pueblo itself, a general question of what is that all about? What's that related to?
So because there's kind of a continued occupation, actually within a stone's throw of the site, that the burning of the Pueblo is very likely a ceremonial closing, in which the Pueblo itself, because it's stone and then plastered with clay, it would be actually hard to burn accidentally. So fire it's designed to resist kind of accidental ignition. So very likely, I think this is an intentional closing of this structure. I mean, over generations or over decades, these kind of pueblos probably, get infested with bugs and become not very nice places to live. So I think what they did is they ripped out a lot of the plaster, particularly of the wood, added probably some fuel, and then do seem to leave some stuff on the floor. Most of it is just little artifacts that perhaps were just overlooked, but there was actually a big concentration of corn, a couple bushels left in the center of one room. And then I think they lit it on fire intentionally to kind of burn it down. As I said, that hearth, that rectangular hearth remnant, does suggest there was an earlier version of the Pueblo, and what we see is the later version. So this final destruction, I think, is an intentional kind of ceremonial closing. And there is precedent in the Southwest of groups kind of formally closing and burning and shutting this off.
Right. I mean, for the viewer that asked that, like exactly as Matt just said, like there's tons of precedent for this.
Yeah.
This is going on, well through the population history of the Southwest region. So I think we're going to close it there, Matt. We're a little bit past 5 o'clock. We want to be respectful of your time. We really appreciate you taking the time to do this. This was so great. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. Thank you. This has been great.
Awesome.
Thanks a lot.
And thank you to all the viewers, and come back next week. All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.